Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is Recent RPS Studies, Maine and Maryland. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA, and we have with us our host for today's webinar, Warren Leon. Warren is the Executive Director of the Clean Energy States Alliance. We have a number of excellent guest speakers with us on the line today. Before I pass it over to them, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our attendees for this webinar are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of the webinar. You can call in using a telephone, or you can connect using your computer mic and speakers. If you'd like to minimize the webinar console so that you can view the presentation full screen, you can click on the orange arrow that you see circled there. That arrow will also expand the control panel so that you can use some of the functionality there. And one of the things on the control panel to direct your attention to is the questions box. We encourage you to type in your questions as you think of them throughout the webinar and hit send. We will be answering questions following our presentations, and we would like to get to your question. To make sure that we do, type it in when you think of it. Don't wait until the very end. We do have a lot of people registered for today's webinar. That should mean a lot of questions. Make sure that we get to your question by typing it in as soon as you think of it. On a final note, this webinar is being recorded. We will send you an email with a copy of the webinar recording and a PDF of the slides, probably sometime this afternoon. And we'll also be posting all of those webinar materials on our website at cesa.org/webinars. And that is a good URL to know because that is also where we post information about upcoming webinars, and it's where you can find archives of all of our previous webinars. So with the housekeeping out of the way, I would like to pass it over now to Warren Leon. As I said, Warren is the Executive Director of the Clean Energy States Alliance, and he's going to get us started.
Hey, thank you very much, Samantha. Clean Energy States Alliance, let me tell you a little bit about it before we go into the content of today's webinar. We're a national membership organization composed of public agencies, mostly state agencies, in about 20 states, and you could see our members here on the screen. We do a lot of information sharing. We do group projects among our members. We do activities and events like this webinar for broader audiences as well. And one recent initiative that we launched was the 100% Clean Energy Collaborative, which is a collaborative specifically of those states that have embraced 100% clean energy goals. We'll be working with them to figure out how they could better plan for achieving their goals. And we'll be doing a lot of outreach to broader audiences around that topic. And if we can go to the next slide. Today's webinar in part links into the 100% Clean Energy Collaborative, but it also links into the work that CESA has done for many years related to renewable portfolio standards. Renewable portfolio standards have been probably the single most important state policy advancing clean energy in the electricity sector. And it's very important to evaluate how that policy has been going and what its potential is in the future. And as states move towards thinking about 100% clean energy, it's also undoubtedly the case that RPS policies will remain an important part of trying to reach for that 100% goal. Well, today we're going to be focusing on studies that have assessed the RPS in two different states. A study that was done by Exeter Associates of the RPS in Maryland, and a study about the Maine RPS that was done by Sustainable Energy Advantage and Synapse Energy Economics. We're going to start with Maryland. I'm going to introduce our speakers for that. We'll then hear that presentation. After that, I'll introduce the speakers for the Maine presentation. And after that, there'll be time for your questions. So the two people who'll be talking to us about Maryland, the first one is Rebecca Widiss, who's a senior analyst at Exeter Associates. Her work there includes economic modeling, database development, socioeconomic analysis related to the siting of power plants and transmission lines, and energy policy analysis. She was the primary author of a report on energy storage issued in late 2018 for the state of Maryland. And prior to joining Exeter, she worked for Voice of America and Business for Social Responsibility. And she's going to be joined on this presentation by Matt Hoyt, who's a senior analyst at Exeter Associates, where he specializes in utility sector policy and regulation for state and federal clients. His past work has included evaluating demand-side management and demand response opportunities at U.S. Army facilities and co-authoring a report on the status and future prospects for nuclear power in Maryland. Prior to joining Exeter in 2016, Matt worked at AEP Energy and Target Point Consulting. So let me turn it over to Matt and Rebecca.
Okay, thanks a lot. Obviously, I'm Rebecca and I'm up first. I also wanted to quickly give credit to our coworker, Kevin Porter, who was actually the leader of our project and is on the line as well. Next slide. Okay, just to give you guys a sense of where we're headed, we wanted to give you some background on Maryland's RPS just to know its kind of quirky features and the history of our study. And then the bulk of our time will be spent going over some of the key findings that we came up with. We're going to try to focus on the methodologies that we used that we think worked well or were at least interesting and maybe worth replicating and tweaking elsewhere. And we're also going to be trying to stress findings that probably have relevance beyond Maryland's border. And then we'll leave with some parting thoughts. Okay, so just to let you know, Maryland's RPS is constantly being adjusted by the legislature. This timeline shows the types of changes that are made. Typically, there have been ratcheting up of the percentage requirements, tweaking how widely or how broad the region where resources can be located will be, and then throwing additional technologies into the mix. And often, as you can see, legislatures make all these changes at once. Okay, so where are we at right now with the Maryland RPS? We are aiming to have 50% of our retail energy sales come from renewable energy by 2030. We have a very ambitious solar carve-out. I believe that percentage-wise, this is actually the highest carve-out goal in the country. We've also got a little bit of tier 2 remaining in the mix. And like almost all the East Coast states, we're looking at putting in offshore wind. One thing that is sort of a theme of our presentation and our report is that the Maryland RPS is truly a compromise between many, many competing priorities. We have the wind and solar companies, hydro and biomass, utilities, environmental advocates, consumer advocates, and as a result, there are some inherent tensions in the legislation between encouraging new resources and maintaining existing ones, lowering costs and promoting in-state development. And none of these are really unique to Maryland, which is why we think our report has a lot to say for other states as well. Okay, so just to let you know, this was commissioned by the Maryland General Assembly. They wanted a very comprehensive report that would look at a whole slew of questions in terms of the effectiveness of the RPS, both historically and a little bit prospectively. So the resulting report is also quite comprehensive. If you check it out, you'll see it's got several hundred pages. And the overarching theme throughout is these trade-offs and how policy design affects the performance of our RPS. We really wanted to help people move beyond the generalizations so they could see where trade-offs are at work and decide which outcomes are most important and under what circumstances. And we'll show examples of this as we go over our key findings. And time-wise, you can see that the Power Plant Research Program, which is an arm of Maryland's DNR, Department of Natural Resources, put out an RFP in 2017. Exeter was approved as the company that would be providing the legwork on the report in 2018, and the final report was turned in December 2019. Okay, so we thought that one of the most fundamental things that people needed to understand in order to think about the impacts of the RPS are what resources are actually being tapped to fulfill our RPS. As you can see on the left, you have some usual suspects and then you have some unusual suspects. So wind is the #1 resource at the moment, but black liquor, which is a byproduct of paper mill production, was #2 in 2017 and remains important in Maryland, although not in the rest of PJM. And what that really means is, in terms of emissions, you've got a lot of Maryland RPS compliance coming from resources with emissions profiles. Then on the right, you can see how Maryland stacks up literally with some of its neighbors that also have RPS policies. Because we have an expansive Tier 1 requirement where many resources are eligible, we have a more diverse resource mix than almost everyone except for Pennsylvania all the way on the right. The states in the middle used to have, in many cases, a more diverse mix, but have been moving towards restricting what's allowed for Tier 1 compliance. And that, as a result, has shifted them towards greater and greater reliance on wind in particular. One of the big surprises for us was when we looked at the vintage of facilities that were providing RPS recs. And as you can see from the slide, over half of the recs that have been used for RPS fulfillment were actually in action before the RPS was ever created. So to the extent that policymakers really want to be driving new renewable energy development, that's something to think about. And you can see that this really occurs in Tier 1 and Tier 2, but not the solar carve out. So again, we're trying to make it very easy for policymakers to see what's happening in every tier. And this is something that happens throughout our report. On the right, you can see a breakdown of in-state versus out-of-state. This is probably one of the #1 topics of discussion among policymakers. There's such a strong desire to see the RPS as a driver of in-state economic development. And so we have a lot of discussion in the report about the pros and cons, the expenses of wind recs here versus wind recs elsewhere in PJM, same for solar. And right now you can see that despite everyone's desire, or many people's desire, the economics are driving most compliance to be from out of state. And now I will pass over the microphone to Matt.
Hi, everybody. This is Matt Hoyt. So perhaps it's of no surprise to most of our listeners, one of the major areas of interest to legislatures in Maryland were the rate impacts of the Maryland RPS. So our approach to studying this question was to adopt the same methodology used by LBNL and NRAIL, that's the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab and National Renewable Energy Lab, and that was to take renewable energy costs and their rate impacts as a function of renewable energy credits plus alternative compliance payments divided by estimated total retail costs. So that's what you're seeing in the graph on the left. And as you can see from the graph, the compliance costs peaked at about 1.8% in 2016 before falling, and they remained low into 2018 at about 1.1%, though it's not shown on the graph. One thing of note is that since Maryland has increased its RPS going into the next decade up to 50%, overall rec costs have risen pretty sharply. So I guess we'd encourage you to stay tuned to see what rec price will be going forward. It's also something we consider on the next slide. And then in addition, on the right, we provide a comparison of Maryland to other states in PJM. I guess one thing to note, and it's highlighted throughout our report, is that we focused on differentiating costs between tier to highlight the trade-offs between in-state carve-outs and out-of-state. So as you can tell in the graph on the left, the solar carve-out contributed as much as 30% of overall rate impact. And this is consistent with the graph on the right, which compares Maryland to other states. The states that tend to have higher rate impacts usually have higher carve-outs or more restrictive eligibility requirements. So it's another example of the complex dynamics of the REC market. So as I mentioned, in addition to looking at historical rate impacts, we use the same methodology to look at future rate impacts. This graph in particular just shows estimated compliance costs for residential customers under both the 25% and 50% RPS. These impacts peak in 2030 at approximately 7.6% of retail bills. So it's a pretty substantial increase from the slide I just showed you. A major driver of this increase is the cost of offshore wind. So as Rebecca mentioned earlier, and it's shown on the slide, Maryland is adding as many as 1,200 megawatts of additional offshore wind over the next decade. So despite declines in the cost of offshore wind within our estimates, it's still just a major portion of the Maryland RPS, and these resources tend to be more expensive than alternatives. There's a couple of simplifying assumptions baked into these estimates of future rate impacts. For example, we used REC futures for the initial year prices and then adjusted for inflation from there on. We also assume that the solar carve-out is met at the cost of the alternative compliance payment rate in some of these future years. To account for these simplifying assumptions, we also did an alternative approach that's included in the report that uses some different pricing scenarios. So we'd encourage you to look at that to see some alternative estimates of prices. With regards to emissions, we looked at average emissions per kilowatt hour on a PJM-wide basis. Excuse me. This is because it's important to consider, as Rebecca showed earlier, as many as 80% of renewable energy credits come from out-of-state resources. So the impact on global emittance like CO2 is really a PJM-wide phenomena. And what our study showed is that Maryland's RPS specifically contribute to as much as a 0.8% drop in PJM-wide CO2 emissions. And if you think about this, this is roughly proportional in 2017 to the size of the Maryland RPS, which had a tier 1 of about 13%, as well as its overall composition within PJM. So Maryland made up about 8% of PJM-wide sales. And I guess similar to the future rate impacts estimates, we did make some assumptions. In this case, we assumed that all RECs would have gone to resources that may not have operated in the absence of these RECs, which matches the premise of RECs, which is to provide a subsidy. Another important note, though, is as Rebecca stated earlier, the Maryland RPS does include some emitting type resources like municipal solid waste, landfill gas, and black liquor. And as a consequence, the Maryland RPS did not contribute to reductions in PJM-wide SO2 and NOx emissions. In fact, in some cases, we saw higher emissions as a result. And this is due to the concurrent trend of declining coal resources in PJM, bringing down the SOx and NOx emissions within PJM-wide, whereas Maryland continues to support resources with an emission profile. For job impacts, we historically relied, for the historic portion, we relied on existing estimates from several sources. And I guess I'll step back and note for some context at this point, in Maryland, energy-related jobs make up a smaller share of the economy than nationwide. According to DOE in 2016, about 1.1% of employment in Maryland was in traditional energy jobs like power generation, fuels, or transmission, distribution, et cetera. And this is compared to a national average of 2.4%. And then a related caveat is that many of the energy jobs in Maryland are related to energy efficiency specifically. But even with that context, we saw that Maryland ranked third among the states, the PJM states that we evaluated in terms of renewable energy jobs as a share of total energy employment. Most of these jobs were predominantly in construction. They were largely concentrated in solar, which, as you'll see in this graph, there's some countervailing trends there. There's some recent declines in solar jobs in particular, which ties to an overcompliance with the solar carve-out, which occurred in many states in PJM. As a result of that solar overcompliance, we saw a decline in solar renewable energy credit costs, which reduced the available subsidy and led to decreases in new construction activity. This is very rapidly changing with the increase in Maryland's RPS. To gauge future impacts, we used an input-output model known as InPlan. And for these scenarios, we looked strictly at the 50% RPS and then focused on solar and offshore wind, which are both in-state carve-outs and the two areas that are expected to grow the most over the next decade. And in total, we estimated approximately 40,000 new full-time equivalent jobs and 7.6 billion in in-state sales revenue from 2019 to 2030. In addition to looking at through InPlan at job estimates, we also did a lit review of future manufacturing and assembly opportunities associated with offshore wind. It's a very hot topic right now. And our study highlights, I think interestingly and importantly, there's a wide variety of manufacturing opportunities, not just some of the headline grabbing opportunities through ports. One area that we evaluate in our report that's of growing interest to a lot of states right now is the impact of the RPS and other energy-related policies on environmental justice communities. So the Maryland RPS law required us to study this topic. One challenge for this is that neither Maryland nor the federal government has an official definition of an EJ community. So for the purposes of our assessment, we developed our own definition and created our own high-level screening analysis using the Environmental Protection Agency's EJ Screen tool. What we found was that there's a disproportionate allocation of benefits from the RPS compared to the proportion of the population in census tracts that were identified as EJ communities. For our study, we did a scoring rubric to assess this, and we evaluated based on jobs, job impacts, emission impacts, and land use impacts. It's worth noting that there's a number of other alternative approaches you could use to doing this type of assessment. So we're looking forward to seeing how other states refine and build upon this approach to evaluate this question as it becomes more prominent. And finally, in terms of parting thoughts, I'll just reiterate what Rebecca said earlier. The Maryland RPS is often expected to be a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So that includes being a driver of renewable energy development, a tool for combating climate change and improving local air quality, a source of jobs and economic development, an impetus and sustainer of in-state businesses. And what we really hope to convey in our report is that there's trade-offs involved among many of these objectives. So as noted above, we did see that the Maryland RPS sparked new wind and solar capacity. It also led to some modest increases in jobs, but at the same time, it's unusual in allowing resources like municipal solid waste and black liquor. So though it's met its goals to date at reasonably low cost, it's also not necessarily met environmental justice aims so far. Going forward, given these trade-offs, we think it's important for policymakers to understand that there are potential ways they can prioritize the design to meet certain objectives, and hopefully our report conveys those different opportunities. And finally, in terms of additional resources in the report, it is a detailed report. It covers, as Rebecca mentioned, it covers 17 different general and specific requirements. So I would encourage folks to take a look at the full report or at least the executive summary to get a sense of what else is in there. This includes primers on non-RPS policies, as well as descriptions of the strengths and weaknesses of potential changes to the Maryland RPS.
Hey, great. Thank you very much, Rebecca and Matt. Before we go on to the second presentation, let me point out to folks that after this webinar, you'll get an email from us with links to the recording of the webinar and the slides, and we'll also include in that links to where you can get the report. But in case somebody is listening to this after the fact, Matt or Rebecca, can you tell people where they could find the report if they were just searching out of the blue?
Sure. You can go to the Power Plant Research Program website within Maryland DNR, and they will have the report live on their website.
Hey, great. Thanks very much, Rebecca. Well, let's go to this second report, which is about Maine. And unlike the Maryland report, which primarily looked backwards, the Maine report primarily looked forward. Unlike the Maryland report, which was required by state government and produced for state government, the Maine report was initiated by nonprofit groups, and they contracted with Sustainable Energy Advantage and Synapse Energy Economics to produce the report. And we're lucky to have with us today two people who worked on the report, and let me tell you about them. The first person you'll be hearing from is Jason Gifford, who's a senior director at Sustainable Energy Advantage, and he has over 20 years of experience in renewable energy policy development and market analysis. At SEA, he conducts research and analysis in support of decision-making for a wide range of public and private sector entities. He's led or contributed to RPS market analyses throughout New England, New York, and the PJM region, and he's co-lead for SEA's New England Renewable Energy Market Outlook. And he's going to be joined by Patrick Knight of Synapse Energy Economics, who performs consulting, conducts research, and assists in writing testimony and reports. Much of his work at Synapse focuses on analysis and modeling of the New England electric system in light of new and existing laws and regulations. His recent work has included developing free open source tools for assisting policymakers' analysis of the national energy system. Those tools include EPA's AVERT model and Synapse's EV Ready tool. Well, let me turn it over to Jason and Patrick.
Good afternoon. This is Jason Gifford. Thank you, Warren, and to CESA for the opportunity to speak with everyone today. We appreciate it. There you go. For those not familiar, SEA and Synapse have collaborated on numerous occasions to conduct analysis like the one we're talking about today throughout the Northeast. And this gives us an opportunity to take a deep dive into renewable energy policy and deployment and their associated market impacts and outcomes through an iterative modeling between our two firms. The purpose of this analysis was to evaluate the potential impacts of a renewable portfolio standard expansion on renewable energy deployment and jobs, emissions, and ratepayers. So Maine's RPS began actually back in 2000 with a focus on existing resources, particularly biomass and hydroelectric generators. A component for new facilities was added to the Maine RPS in 2008, and then this study evaluated the potential expansion of demand for new resources, in particular another 40% by 2030. The analysis was comparative in nature, so that is, it focuses on the difference in modeling outputs for two scenarios. One, a reference case in which Maine's RPS policy was held constant, and a second, the 80% by 2030 scenario, reflecting the proposed policy expansion. So this type of analysis really must be conducted in a regional context. Attractive as it might be to try to focus on demand in Maine and facilities in Maine, it's really not possible or appropriate. Each of the New England states has its own RPS, and their imperfectly overlapping eligibility criteria creates a complex set of interactions as recs disperse, if you will, across New England to fulfill RPS demands. So acknowledging the regional market dynamics is central to understanding state-specific outcomes. So with this regional context in mind, our study found that the increase in Maine RPS demand would be met by a combination of new supply, largely in response to the procurement activities that are also covered in Maine's legislation, and regional surpluses expected as a result of procurement activity in other states already enabled through prior legislation as part of or to supplement renewable portfolio standard programs in other markets. So the analysis in Maine estimates that approximately 1,200 megawatts of solar and wind, with roughly 700 of that expected to occur in Maine based on our supply curve analysis. So while the study focuses on the Maine RPS, it's also important to keep in mind that Maine will benefit from facilities that are built in Maine, but to serve the other state policies as well. So further, this slide, which is the final one for me, explains that prior policy activities in the other New England states have created an expectation of surplus over the next several years. So in other words, long-term procurement in New England is, in the aggregate, greater than incremental supply, or is expected to be greater than incremental supply. In the right-hand chart, you can see that Maine's legislation had both supply and demand-side components, and that for the period after 2026, additional supply is expected to be needed to match the increasing Class 1A targets between now and 2030. But then in the left-hand chart, we show that supply from other regional policies is expected to significantly outpace demand in those states, leaving plenty of supply to fulfill Maine's RPS increase after 2026 without the need for additional development. So just to rephrase, the RPS policies and equilibrium in those markets depends on both supply side policy and demand side policy. And RPSs were born as a demand side policy, but long-term procurements in recent years have come into favor, including those of significant scale for offshore wind. And so what we have looking forward is a bit of a defined surplus for the region as a whole, wherein the prescribed long-term supply contracting opportunities outpace renewable energy demand increases in some states more than others. But here we show in aggregate that there's expected to be significantly more supply than demand in the latter half of the 2020s, which plays an important role for fulfilling Maine's RPS demand increases without requiring corresponding supply builds for every megawatt hour of additional demand. So at this point, I'd like to pass control to Patrick to talk about the study's jobs, emissions, and other findings.
Thanks, Jason. So before I get into the findings, I just want to spend a couple of minutes talking about the modeling tools that we use for this project and to describe how they capture the dynamics like that renewable supply and demand interaction that Jason was just talking about. So at the core of our work, there are two primary models that we use, REMO and Encompass. REMO is a proprietary model developed by SEA, and it works by giving it a set of parameters about projected electricity demand, renewable policies like RPS, technology costs, and energy prices. And it takes these together and provides a forecast of expected project builds by resource type and location. At the same time, it also provides expected REC prices for each of the relevant policy categories under consideration. So for this project, we were mainly focused on the Maine Class 1 tier, but as Jason showed a couple of slides ago, the RPS policies throughout New England are heavily intertwined, so it's really necessary to model all of them. Next, we take the renewable build data from the REMO model and feed it into the Encompass model over here at Synapse. Encompass is a production cost and capacity expansion model of the electric sector. And it works by taking together operational data for each and every power plant in New England and combining that with data on transmission constraints, imports and exports with adjacent balancing authorities, fuel price projections, expected demand for electricity, and many other inputs together to develop hour by hour outputs of generation, prices, and emissions for every state. So this is really important. Encompass isn't just a spreadsheet model, it's a more sophisticated model that really allows us to take into account dynamic changes that are projected over the next 10 years and to provide a quite rigorous projection of what a future under an enhanced RPS might look like. So those are the two primary models, but three other models that we use for this project that I think are worth talking about are COBRA, our rate and bill impact model, and IMPLAN. So I'll talk about those briefly. COBRA is a model developed by US EPA. It's a health impact screening model, and its purpose is to translate changes in criteria pollutant emissions at specific power plants into public health impacts. So just like the folks at Exeter were talking earlier today about the reductions that Maryland's RPS might cause for SOx and NOx, using COBRA, we can take a look at what happens if Maine's RPS policy, say, reduces emissions of NOx and SOx at a particular power plant in Massachusetts or Connecticut or somewhere in Maine, and see how that emission gets transported across the New England states and elsewhere, and discern the impacts on things like hospitalization, asthma incidences, or premature death. We also use Synapse bill and rate impact model, which is a spreadsheet model that takes together data on energy and capacity prices and rec prices from Encompass and REMO to develop impacts on rate and bills. And I'll give a summary of those in just a minute. The third model is the same model that the Exeter folks used in their study, which is the IMPLAN model. IMPLAN is an input-output model, and at least as we use in this study, it's importantly a net jobs analysis, where we're not only looking at the impact of the RPS in terms of creating jobs, say from new solar construction, but we're also making sure we look at the other half of the ledger in terms of what if generation from gas plants is decreased, and what are the impacts of jobs there. Just like in the Maryland study, we looked here at direct, indirect, and induced jobs. Before I jump into the outputs, I do want to mention that the focus of this particular project was Maine, but because of the intertwined nature of the New England energy market, we produce outputs for virtually all of the states in New England. And that this is the same sort of framework that we at Synapse leverage for states and provinces throughout US and Canada as we're doing this kind of analysis, this forward-looking analysis all over North America. So to dive into the results, I think first I'll focus on the benefits. So the results of our IMPLAN analysis showed that the increase of Maine's RPS to 80% by 2030, its class 1 RPS to 50% by 2030, results in about 170 jobs added to Maine each year over the study period. And this includes direct, indirect, and induced jobs. There are also other jobs created outside of Maine, but that's not included in this particular total. From an emissions standpoint, we see that the increase in the RPS is likely to reduce Maine's in-state emissions by 10% by 2030, or about 500,000 metric tons region-wide. And if you take a sort of a different perspective at this, and you were to credit Maine with the region-wide electric sector CO2 emissions, so not just the emissions that are reduced in its own state borders, but also in the rest of New England, we estimate that Maine's emissions would fall by 55% relative to a reference case. So CO2 emissions aren't the only things that are affected by an increase in the RPS. Just as in the Maryland study, we also looked at the impacts on NOx and SOx emissions and projected that millions of pounds of NOx and SOx would be reduced as a result of an increase in Maine's RPS. And using the COBRA model, we were able to translate this into health benefits, estimating that there are roughly $500,000 in public health benefits that can accrue each year relative to a reference case. Now turning over to the cost side of the ledger, we anticipated that the net cost to Maine of this new policy is roughly $21 million per year. And that includes both increased costs for essentially incentive payments of about $43 million, but roughly half of this $43 million is offset by decreased energy and capacity market costs, including impacts to price suppression caused by zero marginal cost renewables. When you translate this into customer impacts, we're projecting that Maine customers in the central Maine power utility jurisdiction would have increased bills of about 1% or about $1 per month. And again, this takes into account REC prices, capacity prices, energy prices, and price suppression. For small C&I customers, we're projecting about a similar percentage level of impact, about 1%. And importantly, I want to mention that many of these costs shift over time, just as Jason was saying, that as the interplay of supply and demand from renewable procurements and other New England state RPSs shift over time, we're seeing smaller impacts in the earlier periods and larger impacts in the later periods. So I'm about out of time, so just to wrap up, I want to mention briefly here that shortly after our study was done last spring, Maine passed legislation to expand both its RPS to 50% Class 1 RPS by 2030. It also modified its long-term contracting programs for large-scale and distributed generation. Right now, if you're curious about the state of play in Maine, policymakers are also currently exploring Maine's renewable future through 2050 with focus on the impacts of electrification, say from EVs or heat pumps, and also potentially considering the impacts of even greater renewable expansion. So I think that about does it for us. I think, Warren, we're turning things over to you for questions.
Hey, thanks very much, Pat and Jason. That was very helpful. And there are a number of questions I'll be asking, and I'll go back and forth between the two studies. But let me start with a couple of questions for the Maryland folks. One is just a definitional question. Somebody asked, what's tier 1 versus tier 2? What does that mean? And what's the nature of the carve-out in Maryland? And you may need to unmute.
Yeah, this is Rebecca. So tier 1 is the largest tier. It's pretty much everything the RPS encompasses. Tier 2 is a small and diminishing to soon sunset tier that really just represents large hydro, which has been in the mix from the beginning. I think it may have expired briefly, or it was set to expire and then was rescued legislatively. The carve-outs are all part of the tier 1 requirement. So there is a solar carve-out and an offshore wind carve-out. The solar is percentage-wise, and the offshore wind is megawatt-based. Matt, do you want to add anything?
No, that's great.
And another question for you folks. What caused the decline in REC prices in 2017?
I'll take that question. Based on our analysis of the supply and demand conditions of RECs, the biggest contributor was an oversupply of RECs throughout the PJM-wide area relative to demand from states within PJM. So like the second presenters were noting, REC prices are set on a regional basis, and they're considering supply and demand conditions throughout all of PJM. So what we observed is declines in costs, particularly for solar, as the amount of resources developed in Maryland and the rest of PJM far outpaced the amount of demand from states like Maryland in terms of RPS requirement.
Good, thank you. Let's go to a couple questions for Maine, and one simple one. If somebody is not getting the follow-up email from us and they want to find your study, where would they find it?
Sure, this is Pat. I think the easiest way to get to it is to just Google Synapse SEA Maine RPS study. I believe it's hosted on both of our websites, and you should be able to find it fairly easy that way.
Good. And a couple people were confused by all the percentages. And were you talking about 30%, 50%, 80%, 100%? Why did you focus on the percentages you did, and how does that relate to what is now the target in Maine?
Yes, fair enough. This is Jason. I'll start and then invite Patrick to add as appropriate. Maine has, as with we heard our Maryland presenters describe, many RPS programs have multiple tiers or classes. They signify the same thing, they're just called different things in different states. And they represent different policy objectives as they relate to existing renewables or new renewables. So Maine's first RPS was 30%, and that was focused on its existing fleet. Then came a Class 1 requirement, which was 10% initially, and the initial RPS became known as Class 2, and that was the original 30%. And then, so that gets you to 40. And then the incremental 40%, that was the focus of this study and the subsequent legislation, is we refer to it shorthand as Class 1, but it was actually Class 1A because the eligibility was just slightly different, but it's oriented toward new renewables again. So if you just take them in aggregate, it becomes 50% new, where the definition of that in Maine is anything built after September 1st, 2005, and another 30% for existing resources, which would be before September 1st, 2005, which brings you to a total of 80%.
Thank you. Let's go back to Maryland for a second, and we'll get back to Maine in a few minutes. In the case of Maryland, when you were determining rate impacts, did you consider the possibility that there would be lower fuel and capital costs since increased renewables will allow Maryland to reduce reliance on fossil fuels?
This is Matt. It is something we considered, but for the purposes of our baseline estimates, we predominantly relied on existing sources of estimates for retail costs and then adjusted them for inflation. So it's a very simplified approach. In our alternative scenarios, we do project further declines in other cost components, and we have discussion of contributors to total retail costs. So if we were looking at it as a percent of total cost, it's discussed in the report. I don't think there were explicit scenarios where we modeled that as a percentage basis, but it's a great question. It's one we were aware of as we developed our assessment.
Well, let me ask another question that relates to that in a different way. You had included in your analysis the increased costs associated with developing offshore wind and paying for the incremental cost of the RECs for offshore wind. But was there any way to consider the potential that developing all that offshore wind would make the costs of other competing energy less expensive because they'd be playing in a more competitive market?
I guess there's two notes I'll make along those lines. We didn't mention this in the presentation, but for this portion of the study, we also used previous modeling we had done for the long-term electricity report in Maryland to provide some additional context for our assessment. And the important note I wanted to make is that Maryland is still a relatively small part of PJM, so the benefits and impacts in terms of overall decreasing cost within PJM are relatively small. So we did account for this through the LTR. We made note of it in the report, but we didn't find substantial decreases in overall system costs because of the renewable energy added as a result of the Maryland RPS.
Okay, thank you. And let me ask you actually just one more question. A couple people asked this, and this goes to your slides where you were showing the comparative costs of the Maryland RPS versus other RPSs in PJM. And a couple of people want to know a little bit more about where do those other costs appear? What was the report that you were getting that data from?
Sure. We developed those estimates using the same methodology as we did for the Maryland estimates, and that's the methodology borrowed from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, National Renewable Energy Lab, comprised of REC costs plus ACPs divided by estimated total retail costs. To get the actual REC costs and ACP costs, we did the legwork to look through the compliance reports for each of these states where available, or we'd look at other sources of information that would publicly available reporting what REC costs and ACPs were. And for the total retail costs, we used an adapted version of estimates from EEI.
Okay, great. Let's go back to Maine for a second. And I'm going to read this question. And this person writes, I don't know how much gas Maine burns, but if it's a factor, did you look at methane emission reductions? And if so, did you include upstream emissions, e.g. at the well sites?
This is Pat. That's a great question. For this project, we only focused on direct electric sector emissions. So we're talking about emissions that from CO2 emissions specifically from fossil fuel combustion at the power plants. So there are gas plants in Maine. There is gas, transportation of gas via pipeline to Maine, but we didn't look at leakage or upstream methane leaks or anything like that. We just focused on the direct emissions from the electric sector.
Okay, and I know the Maryland study, as we heard, they considered some of the healthcare costs. And to what extent did you consider healthcare costs? And what you said, you had some information in there about the impacts of emissions, but could you say a little bit more about healthcare and the Maine RPS increases that you were modeling?
Yeah, of course. So like I said, the way that we modeled it for this project was to use US EPA's COBRA model. And what COBRA does is it looks at differences in emissions and criteria pollutant emissions of NOx and SO2 and other pollutants between two different scenarios within one particular year. So we had a reference case and we had a 80% by 2030 case. And between each of those cases in each of the years, we observed some decrease in NOx and SO2 emissions caused by greater renewables from the Maine RPS. Using COBRA, we can tell the model where the emission decreases happen. So if there's a power plant in, say, Massachusetts or New Hampshire or Maine that reduces their output as a result of Maine's increased renewable requirement, COBRA tracks how those emission decreases would have otherwise been transported across state borders, and models how they fall on people who live in these states. And essentially it has a set of underlying factors developed from the literature that say for a particular set of demographics based on each county's census data, we would expect a change in NOx emissions of X to translate into Y reductions in asthma incidences or premature death. And each one of these values in COBRA has an incidence value, so like number of asthma attacks, and also a monetized value. So again, using literature from public health, translating those asthma attacks into monetized dollar amount. So that's how we're able to get to the $500,000 per year impact or benefit really from the Maine RPS.
Great, thanks very much. And let's go back to Maryland for a second. I have a slightly complicated question here that someone wrote in, and they ask, can you reconcile the impact of Maryland's RPS on CO2 emissions and air quality and the fact that a meaningful portion of the recs used for compliance come from facilities that predate the RPS? Has there been an analysis on air quality, greenhouse gas impact of the RPS when looking specifically at newer facilities that might have been built because of RPS incentives as opposed to just everything that's being used to provide recs for the RPS?
This is Matt. Within our assessment, we did not separate by resource type besides just tier when evaluating this question. It's a great question, and it's one we wanted to highlight in the report, given that such a high proportion of resources did come from renewable energy generation sources available before the RPS was implemented. So I guess I'll just note that this is a trade-off we highlight and discuss throughout the report. The emissions analysis we did does not break it out in that way. And I do think it's a great question, though, and it gets at some of those trade-offs we were pointing out between supporting in-state renewable resources like developing additional solar in-state versus sustaining existing resources and protecting those jobs from things like municipal solid waste and black liquor.
Okay. And speaking of the black liquor, somebody wrote in to ask, does black liquor remain in the RPS long term, or is that phased out at some point?
Well, it basically this is Rebecca. It comes up for review in the legislature almost every year. I think there was even legislation again this year to try to remove it. Right now, it's still in the mix.
Okay. And I want to see if I had time for one more question, but I think what I'm going to do is, we only have a few minutes left. I wanted to give each team like 1 or 2 minutes to say anything else you want to say, what you especially think people should look at your report to see, or any lessons learned for folks who might do future RPS studies. I don't know who wants to go first. Maybe let's start with Maryland. Any famous last words, advice for others who might want to do a RPS evaluation study?
Sure, this is Matt. I think we've already emphasized a number of times that there's a lot of complex trade-offs involved in RPS. Another note I'll note for people who are developing RPS studies in the future is that we had a wide variety of topics to address in this report, as you can tell from the long list of sections that we didn't even cover. So I would encourage folks to take a look at that. We used a variety of different methodologies, a number of different data sources to develop our analysis, and included a variety of caveats that I think would be of interest to our audience. So I would encourage folks to take a look at the report and just keep in mind that there are trade-offs when you're evaluating certain aspects of an RPS policy. It's sometimes important to consider the fact that there could be downsides in other areas that may have also be interest to your stakeholders.
Great. And Jason or Patrick, do you have any famous last words and advice for others who might want to do a study that's a forward-looking study about the potential to increase RPS targets?
Sure, this is Jason. I can start with two interrelated things. One is there's quite a body of experience now in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic with the implementation of renewable portfolio standards. So there's quite a lot to learn for states that are looking to evolve or expand their programs. But in order to get the most out of that, I would say that the most important thing for policymakers or others looking to produce such a study is to think about what you're trying to accomplish. And the more specific you can make the question that you're asking, the more likely it is that you'll be able to pull together actionable information. Because at the end of the day, each state does have slightly different objectives, and even those objectives have evolved over time.
Thank you. And Patrick, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just echo what's already been said here. You know, this Maine study wasn't the first time that Jason and I had looked at RPS impacts of RPS expansion in New England. We did a Massachusetts study a couple of years ago, and then a Connecticut study shortly after that. And one of the things that we kept running into was the dynamic that Matt had articulated, where there's a lot of interesting impacts that come out of changing RPS, and sometimes you end up with impacts that are sort of countervailing each other in terms of whether you're thinking about jobs or costs or emissions or in-state impacts versus out-of-state impacts. And I think one of the things that I've certainly learned from doing all of these studies is how important it is to try to be as comprehensive as possible. You know, like Jason said, to keep your question articulate and constrained if possible, but you know, you want to make sure that you're stepping back far enough and taking the whole view into account when you're talking about all the costs and benefits that might result from an RPS.
Hey, thanks very much. And I want to thank Rebecca, Matt, Jason, and Patrick, all of you, for excellent presentations. And I'd encourage everybody on the line to go look at these studies. They're very interesting, and these brief presentations are only able to touch the surface. I also want to point out that we're going to have some additional webinars coming up, including two related to the 100% Clean Energy Collaborative, an overview of 100% clean energy states and the 100% Clean Energy Collaborative on May 11th, and a webinar on May 15th on decarbonizing electricity. Thanks all of you for joining today. Thanks to our speakers, and I hope to see you again on future Clean Energy States Alliance webinars. Bye now.